Got it.
Yep.
Thanks.
Okay. Um, um, After World War II, when all of these new pesticides were being developed, it was an overwhelming um, feeling about them. People thought that was a miraculous technology and that we would never have to worry about pests again. Using lots of pesticides was viewed as modern farming. Initially it had very low risk. It always worked. It was quite inexpensive, so it was good for business because it didn't cost that much. And back then there were very few regulations, so you could use pesticides as you wished. And even in the scientific community, if you look through papers and journals back then, it seemed to be that the job of the pest scientist was to learn how to use the chemicals more effectively. There really was, alternative methods were not as heavily researched as they are today. Then in the 50s and 60s, things started to go wrong. Non-target species were killed. Other species of insects and other organisms that were in the past not a problem were released as pests themselves because you were killing their natural enemies. Wildlife was affected. Pest resurgence happened when natural enemies were killed. Pest resistance to pesticides appeared and grew rapidly. There was contamination of soil and water with the pesticides, and eventually it started to affect human health. So, and we have a term we call the pesticide treadmill, which happened back then, where you found that pesticides killed pests, killed other things at the same time. Resistance appears, so you increase the amount of pesticides you put on the crop to overcome that. That released secondary pests, so then you had to spray the secondary pests. You got resistance in the secondary pests. You added or changed the chemicals, and that just repeat the sequence. That's what we call it, a treadmill. So at the end, you were essentially using many pounds of pesticides per acre. And resistance built up rather rapidly. You can see that resistance was first found just after these new pesticides were starting to be used in the early 1950s, and grew rapidly after that. Then something happened in the era of the 1960s, primarily, and early 1970s. Rachel Carson, who was actually a Pennsylvanian. She was born near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and she was a kind of a naturalist. She worked for the U.S. Department of the Interior. She wrote a book in 1962 called Silent Spring, where she elucidated the externalities of pesticide use. So you would use pesticides to kill a particular pest, but that pesticide had other effects in the system that were really not taken into account. Of course, she was complaining about the products of a multiple billion-dollar industry, the agrochemical industry. So she was taken to task. She was called before Congress. She was attacked in the news and all this kind of thing. They really attacked her personally for this, but she persevered and really, in my opinion, kind of started the environmental awareness fervor of the 1960s, which culminated in the establishment of Earth Day in 1970, and has resulted in new laws and regulations and government agencies that have been set up to manage the misuse of pesticides. And back then, I was actually your age back then. That was a picture of me there in the middle. And it was the time of the Vietnam War. There was a lot of social upheaval, and the environmental protection and Rachel Carson and pesticides was all part of that back then. So based on this societal push, IPM was born to address the issues of mismanaged pesticides in agriculture. So IPM over 50 years, it's born from the environmental movement. It's adopted through economics, because if you want a farmer to change his or her behavior, you have to make the economic case. You can't say you need to do this practice, but you will lose money. That's not going to work. So you have to prove the economic case with the practitioners. Over the years, it's been expanded by regulations and markets, where increasing regulations like the Food Quality Protection Act of 1996 that focused on the protection of babies, human babies, from too many pesticides on fruits and vegetables, and markets where the use of IPM has been used to market food. Not quite so heavily as the organic movement, but IPM is part of organic anyway. So so the whole program has been expanded since then. And what it shows is that IPM can adapt to conform with biological, economic, and social trends. And so you'll see that the blending in of pollinator protection is just another societally demanded change posed to integrated pest management. Okay, so let's look at the term. I'm assuming that not everybody knows what IPM is in the audience here. So let's look into it a little bit. So the term IPM, what does it mean? Well, P equals pest. What is a pest? A pest is an organism that causes harm to humans or their property. It includes arthropods, mollusks, vertebrates, weeds, fungi, bacteria, viruses. So any living thing and any organism can be a pest. Where are the pests? They are in natural systems, forests, parks, lakes. They're in agricultural systems, crops and animals, and they're in metropolitan systems. So you have cockroaches in your apartment, or in shopping malls and gardens, that type of thing. So essentially pests can be anywhere. But pests have certain attributes. One is that pests are a human construct. We determine what is a pest and what is not a pest. The cockroach doesn't know it's a pest. It's just trying to, make a life for itself and find food and have little cockroaches. So we determine what is a pest. It's situational. So an organism in a certain situation, such as the deer in the forest on the bottom there, is a beneficial thing. But if those deer come out of the forest and go and eat your garden, then they are a pest, and you may need to manage them. So again, another definition: to be considered a pest, a damaging stage of the organism must be present in high enough numbers to cause actual injury to something valued by people, including the people themselves. Okay, so let's look at another term in there, management. What does management mean? So back in the pesticide era, where pesticides were deemed as this miraculous savior of agriculture, there was an attitude that humans could control nature, that we could drive pest populations to zero and essentially just get rid of them and not have to worry about them anymore. Of course, the pests had another thing in mind. So now in IPM, we talk about management, where we don't want to get rid of down to zero these pest populations. We want to suppress them below tolerable levels. And in different systems, it takes different form. In agriculture, there is an economic level that you want to suppress the pest population below. I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail in a minute. But even there are aesthetic thresholds, we call them. So if you If you live in an apartment that has cockroaches in it, how many cockroaches are you willing to tolerate? Or if you have bed bugs, how many bed bugs are you willing to tolerate? So people have their own comfort level with various numbers of pests. And then the third category is when a pest is actually a threat to human populations, like a malaria mosquito or whatever. Then the government gets involved and sets the levels for the pest tolerance. How many mosquitoes would you allow in a particular system? Another part of management is the key pest concept. So you may have many, many pests attacking your crop, but not all of them are tremendously important. There would be a few species that are quite important, and you have to focus your management on those species. We call those the key pests, all right? And then all the other pests you deal with, after you've dealt with the key pests. We also incorporate prevention before remediation. We try to anticipate problems and manipulate the crop and its surroundings to avoid pest problems rather than wait until we have a big, pest problem in the crop and then have to go in there and fix it in a remediating kind of way. So IPM is an integral part of the entire management system. It's not just something you start when the pests show up. So you have to be thinking about IPM when you are all the way from when you are planning where you're going to plant your crop, how to prepare the soil, where to get your transplants. Many things all affect IPM, and IPM affects them. So IPM is an integral part of the entire management system. So there are two basic decision categories in IPM. One is tactical versus strategic. So tactical is when you realize that your Colorado potato beetles have gone over the threshold and you need to deal with them somehow. But strategies are combinations of tactics which over a period of time tend to suppress the pest populations in general. And we can have prophylactic or preventative remedies versus curative. So preventative is you manipulate the system before the pests show up, and curative you apply when the pest is already there. And there are literally thousands of tactics that fall into these categories that can be, if you look around the world, that can be used to battle pest problems. So the other term is integrated, and integrated has many meanings. First of all, your crop is usually attacked by more than one pest at a time, so you have to integrate your management across the different pests. So for instance, if we take a pumpkin plant, it has a whole list of diseases that can be a problem, powdery mildew, Phytophthora, many things like that. It has a whole list of insects that can be a problem, cucumber beetle, squash vine borer. Has many weeds that can be in the field, and it has other pests like rodents and birds and deer that can affect your crop. And typically, several of these are operating simultaneously. So you have to be very clever about how you design your management program for these. Another type of integration after pest types is to make sure it's integrated totally with the production system and also integrated with the environment. So the farmer pretty much focuses his management on the what I call on the inside the fence of the field, so where the crop is being grown. But increasingly we're finding out that what is outside the fence, the larger ecosystem around the field, is also important to pest management and pollinator management for that matter. And so the farmer should turn part of his or her attention to management or preservation or whatever of the system outside of the field. The other thing that gets integrated in IPM is integrated tactics. Typically, you don't want to use a single tactic, especially repeatedly, because the pest will eventually build a resistance to it. So if you want to use multiple tactics and integrate them to kind of keep the pest off balance and not able to build a resistance to a particular tactic. The other thing that's integrated is the goals of the IPM program, and we'll talk about that in a minute here. Okay, so what about the tactics? So we have a toolbox that we can draw from in general. The first we classify as biological control, where you pit one organism against another organism. So a pest, anything, a fungus, an insect or whatever, there's always something there that will eat it. And so if you can cleverly find out what will eat the pest, and you can cultivate that that beneficial organism, then the beneficial organism will take care of your problem to a certain extent. So that's an important tool. Another is cultural. So just as the Sumerians or whatever I was saying there figured out that if they manipulated planting dates of crops, they could avoid pests. There are many cultural practices that can be used to avoid or diminish pest populations. And essentially, what we're trying to do with these cultural practices are lower the general equilibrium position of that particular pest population. We don't have time to get into the details of that now, but maybe later on we can talk about it, or somebody will talk about it, not me. We use host plant resistance quite a bit, either through traditional breeding or through transgenic breeding. We can design or find plants that are resistant to various pests, and they become there. That's a very important tool in pest management. There are mechanical tools that you can use in your own house. You have window screens. Well, there's a mechanical tactic that suppress the pest populations in your house. The mosquitoes can't get in and all that. But there are others. A greenhouse prevents pests from getting to crops. So there are mechanical techniques that you can use. There are legal techniques, quarantines, inspections of imported food coming in the country and on ships and planes and things like this. The pesticide regulations, this is all part of the legal tool in the IPM toolbox. And then there's chemicals. So IPM, depending on the goals of the particular system, does not negate the use of pesticides. They can be used in many of these systems, but they have to be used, what we say judiciously, only when necessary and only in response to some kind of a threat. And when you do use a chemical, you'll have a whole array of chemicals that could be used. You try to pick the ones that are going to disrupt the system the least while still taking care of the pest problem. Other chemicals that are used in pest management include things like pheromones, manipulating the behavioral systems of the pests. And then we have genetic tools. The classic is the screwworm fly, where a fly larva would infest sheep. But they found that if they could grow many, millions of these flies in a factory, so to speak, and then irradiate them, it made the males sterile. And then they would take these millions of sterile males and release them into the environment to reduce the probability of successful mating of this particular fly species. Okay, so tactic relationships. If you're using multiple tactics in a strategy, then you are going to lessen the risk of failure. You're going to stave off resistance. You're going to spread the labor cost on your farm because these different tactics are done at different times of the year. And many of these tactics have other benefits. In addition to suppressing certain pests, for instance, if you use a cover crop like Sudan grass here, Not only does it suppress weeds, but it also conserves water. It maintains the biodiversity on the farm, and it improves the soil structure. Okay, so the integrated goals of any IPM program are economic sustainability. Is it profitable for the farmer? Environmental protection. Are the tactics being used benign to the environment, or they cause only acceptable changes or whatever? So environmental protection is part of it. Social welfare, so human health, social justice is another goal of IPM programs. And IPM is used regardless of your management philosophy. So whether you are a conventional farmer, an organic farmer, or what we say here is a sustainable farmer, somewhere in between conventional and organic, I guess, you use IPM to manage your pests. Now, the tools available and the approaches available in these different management philosophies may change, but the IPM method is still used. So all IPM decisions involve these goals to one extent or another. So IPM draws on many sources of information and knowledge. It draws from the pest sciences, entomology, plant pathology, nematology, weed science. It draws on the crop production sciences, mathematics and statistics, physical sciences, chemistry and physics, social sciences, economics, sociology, psychology, and government policy. So if you're thinking of a robust IPM program, you really have to have knowledge in, most of these areas, or partner with other people who have that knowledge to form a team to attack this. But IPM really is a very, diverse topic. So let's take that diverseness and boil it down to 6 steps. So we like to say that there are 6 steps in an IPM decision. The first is proper identification of the pest and or, any biological control organisms. Now, this is the point in the class where I asked students how many species of insects are there in the world. And of course, we can't do that in this, but let me just tell you that entomologists have described somewhere between 1 and 2 million species of insects in the world. And we haven't described everything. It's estimated there's probably 7 or 8 million species of insects in the world. So that's quite a few species. Now, if you look around the world and count up how many species of insects are considered pests anywhere, in Asia or Africa or in a house or in a farm field or whatever, it's probably somewhere around 4,000 or 5,000 of these species out of the 8 million that are considered pests. So so if you are guessing, if you haven't done proper identification, you're probably guessing wrong that you have a pest in your field. So the proper identification is the very, very important first step. In addition, once you have identified a pest, it opens you up to hundreds of years of research on that pest. And there's a huge literature, and you can go in there and take advantage of other people's experiences to design an IPM approach to your problem. And the rest of the species, well, what are they? They could be beneficial, like pollinators, or biocontrol organisms, or they're just out there being part of the food web and in the forest and fields and things like that. But a very small percentage of insects anyway are actually pests, and that goes for the fungi and the plants and everything else that can be pests. Only a small percentage of the species are pests, and so proper identification is important. Then you have to have threat assessment. Do I have enough of the pests to be worried about? So if you go into your tomato garden in the backyard and you look at all the plants and you see that among 20 tomato plants, you see one aphid, probably you're not going to get too excited about that. And you might say, well, I'll keep my eye on that guy and I'll look at it next week. So what you're doing now is you are monitoring or scouting your crop. But if you go out in your garden, the 2 weeks in the future from there, and you see that there's 100 aphids on every leaf of all the tomato plants, then you have a problem. So somewhere between one aphid on 20 plants and hundreds on every leaf of every plant, there is a threshold. There is an acceptable level. Once you pass that level, then you need to take action. All right. And when you do that, you have to consider how damaging is the individual pest species. Take the aphid. If it's just an aphid that's sucking the sap out of the plant's a big organism, it can take it. But if that aphid has a virus it's carrying that will kill the plant, then that changes the whole system. That individual aphid becomes much more dangerous than it was. That aphid, if it has a virus, becomes much more dangerous as compared with if it's just a plain aphid without the virus. So again, you need to couch all these steps in a bit more knowledge. Okay, then you're going to have many different tactics that you can use to manage a particular problem. So you'll have to properly select that based on what is the species that you have the problem with, how many other pests are there, what are the externalities of the solutions you are considering, all those things. IPM is a feedback system, so once you apply a tactic, and the tactics are very specific on how they should be applied, you need to evaluate the results, because the results are going to tell you if your tactics are working. So the feedback mechanism in the monitoring will tell you not only when the pests arrive and how many there are, but is any tactic you are using, is it working or not? Do I need to adjust what I'm doing? And then the sixth step, and one of the most important, is record keeping, because record keeping provides the database that you will make your future decisions on. The best indicator of what your pest problems will be in a particular crop is what happened in that crop last year and the year before and the year before that. That's going to give you 90% of what to expect in a coming year. So record keeping is an extremely important step in an IPM decision. Okay, decision criteria. So as I alluded to before, we have these levels that we're not trying to get the pest population to zero. We're trying to suppress the pest populations below an acceptable level. Okay, in farming, that's usually economic. In where people live, it's usually aesthetic, and then if it's a health problem for humans, that's usually a regulatory threshold that's used. So if we look at in a farming system to its to this concept, if we see, okay, so this graph has number of pests on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. It could be one season or whatever, but typically in the US, we're in Pennsylvania anyway, and also probably in Freiburg, you have cold winters, and so that in itself suppresses pest populations. But in the spring, the weather warms up, the pest populations begin to grow, and of course, just like COVID-19, that grows in an exponential fashion. And if you don't do anything, it will just keep growing until it hits what we call the carrying capacity. It runs out of food, runs out of space, something like this. But usually that's kind of an unacceptable level. So what we've determined in IPM is we set a threshold. And again, in farming, it's mainly an economic-based threshold. So we have one term we call the economic injury level, once the pest population crosses that economic injury level, the farmer is losing money. Okay, his profit is being affected because the profit is the the comparison of the cost of the control activity in labor, materials, machinery, whatever it is, versus the benefit of performing the management. Okay, so it's what we call the break-even point. And so that point in pest management is the economic injury level. If the pest populations exceed the economic injury level, then your economic well-being is being affected. But what happens is farmers can't, instantaneously react to things. So what we do is we establish another threshold we call the economic threshold, so that when the pest population reaches the economic threshold, then we take management action so that the momentum of the population growth doesn't carry it over the economic injury level. Okay. And so these thresholds are set by economics. Again, it's the cost of doing farm activities versus the benefit of those activities. Okay, when you're making pest management decisions, you have to consider time and space. So we have different time frames. We have short, medium, and long time frames. A typical short time frame in IPM is usually a week. So you essentially scout or monitor your crop on a weekly basis and make pest management decisions from that. And this may be, what's the number of Colorado potato beetles? What's the number of plants affected by, squash vine borer? Whatever it is, and you'll have remedies for that if you're crossing the threshold. But also there are longer time periods. For instance, seasonal. If you're a corn farmer and you are deciding to plant corn in a certain field, in the winter, you're sitting, in your kitchen and looking at a seed catalog, and you are selecting a particular variety of corn to plant. Some of those varieties will have pest resistance attributes. They could, be not friendly to corn borers or something like this. But once you make that decision and buy the seed and plant your crop, you're stuck with your decision for the whole season. In another case, you may be an apple farmer and you may say, okay, I'm going to select these varieties of apple trees and plant them in my orchard. Those varieties some will be, disease resistant or tolerant of insects or whatever. But once you make that decision for an apple tree, you have to live with that decision for 25 years or so. That's how long the apple tree lives. So again, different pest management decisions have different time scales. Let's see here. Same with space. Okay, so you can have small spaces, medium spaces, and large spaces. The basic thing, though, is you have a management unit, which is a space where within that space, whatever pest management tactic you use will be done consistently across that space. Okay, and the space can be a farm field. It could be a section within a farm field. It could be multiple fields on the same farm. Now with precision agriculture, where robots and satellites essentially are controlling tractors and all that, the decision space tends to get smaller and smaller. So you can do a different activity on every square meter of a farm field. Okay. The other thing in pest management that brings in kind of the social aspect of it is that pests do not observe boundaries. Okay. They don't care who owns the land. They don't care where one town ends and another town begins. They move all over the place. So many times you have to have a larger management space. For instance, a valley that contains, um, you know, 50 farmers who are growing apples or something like this. And so then your task becomes to convince all of the farmers in that valley to use certain tactics to treat the valley as a management unit rather than individual farms. If one farmer does not comply, that pest can move out from his or her farm and infest every other farm in the valley. And as we already talked about monitoring a little bit here, mainly with going out in your crop and counting aphids and all that kind of stuff. But monitoring has many different aspects to it also. And these are getting much, much more sophisticated than they have in the past. First of all, you can use, scouting. A person goes out, counts bugs with, using your eyes and things like this. You can set up traps, pheromone traps or whatever, and check the traps weekly to look at pest population changes. Scouting we talked about. In support of the scouting and the trapping, there are many, in the the U.S. universities put out manuals and fact sheets and maps and newsletters and emails and social media output, et cetera, which, inform the farmer on how to manage pests if, his or her monitoring has shown that there's going to be a problem. And increasingly we have IT tools based on research. We can actually predict pest populations. What if you have a population now, what's it going to be like next week? What's going to be like, next month, whatever. And we can react to those. We can use geographic information system tools to run population development models across a large space, but then drill down to, sub-farm level with those. And we also have web-based decision tools, many of them in the artificial intelligence realm, that farmers can use to help them make decisions about pests on their farm. Oh, let me go back there. And so what you will see increasingly, we have a new system in the US called IPIPE, which it's called, I forgot actually what it means, but anyway, it's a national system, web-based system where many people can input data that they're seeing on their farms and all that. It blends in weather forecast, climatic variation, all this kind of stuff, and then will again provide advice for the people with the pest problems, available on the phone and all that, as you are getting used to. Okay, so let's get into IPM implementation. So if you are a pest scientist, many times your responsibility will not just be researching the pests, but also developing programs that you can teach farmers how to manage their pest problems. And essentially what you're trying to do is you're changing human behavior. And I've worked in many, many countries around the world. And my summation of that is the pests are the same everywhere, but it's the people that are different. So the, different human populations have different educational methods, different cultures, different, village structures, many, many things that can either facilitate or impede the use of IPM at the local level. So that's why I say changing human behavior is the hard part of integrated pest management. So IPM is delivered as a program. So you deliver an IPM program addressing all the pests of a particular crop in a particular location. It includes not only decision support tools like I showed you in the previous slide, but also educational programs that farmers in the wintertime can go someplace and be educated, or now I guess on Zoom they would have to go and get educated. So it's a whole package of activities that support the implementation of IPM. So the tools of changing this human behavior are the information education programs, but there's other tools also. For instance, regulation will change human behavior. The Food Quality Protection Act of 1996 in the US restricted the use of pesticides on crops that primarily children ate, fruits and vegetables, because children eat a lot more compared to their body weight of fruits and vegetables than adults do. So a whole regulatory system was invented to, prevent children from consuming pesticides this way. And the regulation is if you do not follow the rules, then you are breaking the law. And so you can be fined or, I guess, put in jail or whatever. So regulation is a great motivator of human behavior. And more recently, the marketplace. Probably the best example of this is the organic agriculture movement, which started, I guess, maybe 30 years ago in earnest. And actually in the US, and I think in other countries also, it also has its own regulations. If you are going to get an organic label on your produce, then you have to follow certain rules, and those rules are enforced. But it also gives the consumer a choice. And so the consumer can choose to buy organic or not buy organic. And so that gives you, this is another tool you have to change the behavior of the farmer. And if you design another education program that informs the citizen and consumer about how crops are grown, how pests are managed, how pesticides are used, then you can utilize this consumer behavior to promote the implementation of your program. The other thing is that, let's see, what did I just do here? Is that IPM programs are not static, they change over time. We call the intensification of IPM in a particular crop the IPM Continuum, and it started back in the pesticide era. So there was, if pesticides were used a lot, they were usually applied on a calendar basis, spray this product every Thursday without really any reason for doing it. There was hardly any information involved in the decision. It went through low-level IPM, which started to use scouting and thresholds. And it went through medium level and high level, which is now ending up in what we call biointensive IPM, where chemical pesticides are being largely eliminated, and there's more of a focus on soil and plant health. So if you're going to have an IPM program, it's your job to move your clients through this continuum. Okay, so let's finally turn to the second P, which is the pollinator. So the second P in integrated pest and pollinator management. And the argument is that we can expand the purview of IPM to include pollination needs. We can protect pollinate in an IPM system. We can protect pollinators from hazards in the crop and managing the ecosystem around the crop to provide other things like nest sites, alternative food sites, sources, et cetera, for pollinators. We do this already for biological control organisms. The pet, and especially these days, the bee health and pollinator health, pesticides being used in crops affecting the bees and stuff. It's been, the regular human populations have been made highly aware of these things. There have been, newspaper articles and television shows and all this other kind of stuff. And really the farmers are caught in the middle on this. They need to please the consumer because they got to sell the crop to the consumer, but they don't necessarily know how to incorporate knowledge of pollinators in their crop management system. So we're already managing other beneficials like parasitoids and predators and things like that. We already have stakeholder communications in IPM. We already have a regulatory system that's responsive to IPM needs. There's already a research, extension, and education system that can be incorporated. Scientists and educators can shift IPM focus to pollinator health, which is already happening, and farmers can, farmers already use and trust IPM. So partnering IPPM with IPM, you can gain all of this good feeling that you've built up over the last 50 years in implementing IPM programs. So, this has begun to happen. We're seeing increased funding for research and extension from federal agencies like National Institutes of Food and Agriculture and others. Pollinator health is finding its way into university education, hence this course. Public education has improved consumer knowledge, so the consumer can now make choices in the marketplace. Like we see a little bee-friendly sign or something on the kumquat, so you can make a choice that way. Government incentives are being brought to bear. We have an agency in the U.S. called the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which essentially distributes probably about $4 billion to farmers every year for conservation efforts. Now, pollinator protection is part of that effort, so you can get money incentives to do pollinator conservation. Regulations are changing, which I call disincentives, because if you do something, off label or whatever, you're going to get some kind of penalty. That's already happening. The private sector, the food industry, is picking up on the sensitivity of consumers to how their food is grown with these farm to fork type of sustainability systems that they're implementing. That's going to require not only IPM, but IPPM. But the devil is in the details. These are highly complex systems. You need a research base, you need communications among scientists and their stakeholders to come up with managing this complex system. But we've already developed this system for IPM, so adding another feature to it, like pollinator protection, shouldn't be that hard of a task. Okay, so you will hear a lot of, let's see, how do I get out of this? Here we go. So you will hear a lot of details of the components of my lecture today, will make up the remainder of this course. For instance, the paper that you read for this course, that used as an example how we blended pollinator protection in with management of pests in apples. Later in the semester, my co-author, Dr. Dave Bittinger, will talk about the details of that. I really didn't have time to go into it today, but these we're just kind of on the beginning of integrating pollinators with pest management, but we have some success already, and I have a good feeling that we'll move in a positive direction. Okay, there you go. A whole 15-week course in 40 minutes. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Ed. That was wonderful. So I think we're running a little bit late on time. So I guess really quickly, if anybody who is not taking the class has a specific question, they're welcome to add that to the Q&A or the chat portion of the Zoom meeting. And we'll just see if there's anything from people who are not members of the class, since we have a separate discussion we'll be transitioning to for students who are taking this for credit.
So there's been a couple chats there. One is from my old student, Farouk. And then, no, that was not me in the picture, but I knew people like that. My hair actually used to be like that many, many decades ago.
Okay, great. So it doesn't look like we have anything coming through for the discussion. So if you are taking the class, you do have a Zoom link. We're going to jump over to a Zoom discussion room where we can have a more intimate conversation with Ed and to talk about the paper that he had us all read. And for those of you outside of the class, thank you so much for joining us. And I just wanted to let you know that next week we have a speaker, Ralph Nowen from Bayer, talking about um, bee immunity and effects in response to exposure of pesticides. And he's actually going to be speaking on the 28th at noon instead of 11 o'clock due to a time zone difference situation. If you're in Germany, nothing has changed for you. So sorry. Daylight savings time is a very interesting thing to straddle across the globe. So anyway, thank you so much. And I look forward to talking with the rest of the class soon.
So Natalie, I should go to this discussion also?
Yes, we would
And
love to have you. Please do.
okay,
You have the
and
link?
what is the link?
If there's just a question that came in on the public Q&A. If you guys want to.
Yes. How can we better explain IPM to the general public who is more inclined to organic production?
Well, the one thing is that IPM is already part of organic. Okay, it's you know, your tool